Good morning. It's 10 minutes to midday. I'm conscious, as Miriam said, that my session's between you and lunch, so I will keep to that time space or do an accelerated presentation. So I'm going to really look at some of the key issues in commercial contracts when you're procuring in an emergency. I'm not going to talk about public sector procurement regulations and the procedures for a procurement under an emergency. I'm speaking when there's an emergency, and however that's defined, as Chris defined, has said, a number of ways to define emergency. What are the key things you need to look at in a contract when you're procuring goods and services? Now, one option is you're so desperate that you basically sign up to the supplier standard T's and C's. I'm not going to recommend that. That is one option that organisations do. But regardless of whether you can negotiate or not, there are certain areas that you should look at in the contract that you're procuring. And remember, because this is an emergency, you won't have time to actually go through and do a bloodbath red line of the supplier's contract. And you also won't have time to present your own contract. Like, best practices, as you know, if you're procuring something complex, you'll provide your own formal contract for the suppliers to bid on. But in this case, you'll probably have to start off, unfortunately, with the supplier's contract. So you need to look at what are the areas that you need to look at. And the devil is in the detail. Look at the delivery date. This is key. You need to make sure that the delivery date is firmly set out in the contract. Avoid sort of provisions that talk about estimates only. You need the certain goods or services on a particular delivery date. It's no point the supplier saying, oh, it's only a best guess estimate. So avoid that sort of provisions and try to strike those out. Liquidated damages. Now, this is a useful provision in a normal case where, the supplier doesn't deliver, you get liquidated damages or delay deductions for every day of delay or every week of delay. That's meaningless here because, you need the goods and services on a particular day. So liquidated damages aren't going to provide you sufficient protection or give insufficient incentive. So that's a meaningless concept when you're procuring in an emergency. Look for the wording in the contract which talks about dependencies and assumptions. So dependencies are usually when suppliers say, yeah, we'll deliver in accordance with this timetable depending on these various things. The more dependencies there are, the more get out there is for the supplier. So you need to look at those dependencies and minimize those dependencies. Assumptions are similar things. So assumptions are basically a supplier will say, yeah, we'll be able to deliver this service or good on these assumptions. Again, you need to narrow these list assumptions because it's very easy for these assumptions not to hold true. So you need to make sure you manage those assumptions or even sort of eliminate them completely. Force majeure. This is the clause right at the end of the contract where you probably lost the will to live, yeah? I'll tell you a story about force majeure clause. I mean, the devil is in the detail. Looking at this contract, and a force majeure definition, acts beyond the control of the party, war, power supply interruption. And then they had an event of force majeure also includes an act or omission of the service provider. I kid you not. So effectively, service provider could not do something, then they could say it's force majeure under the contractual provision. So the devil is in the detail. So look at the force majeure clause. And obviously, in an emergency, a lot of these force majeure provisions will be the very event, that the trigger for you actually procuring. So you need to make sure that the force majeure clause is actually reduced quite considerably. It's not the standard force majeure clause that the suppliers have in the contract. Time is of essence. Very useful provision to have in a contract. Most supplier contract terms won't have that. You may want to insist on putting that in the contract. Trigger for the payment milestone. So I mentioned liquidated damages not providing sufficient incentive. A sufficient incentive may be, okay, if you deliver in accordance with this time frame, we will make the payment. That should provide sufficient incentive. Don't pay in advance because you've lost a lot of negotiating leverage. You may want to pay a portion in advance, but hold a sufficient amount of the charges or the service fee or the amount of the products for actual delivery once they've actually delivered. Now, you're procuring an emergency. So, as I said, you haven't got the time, you haven't got the ability to do many negotiations, so you may not get value for money. You need to acknowledge that. So what you need to do is minimize vendor lock-in. You don't want to enter into a long-term services or product supply contract when you haven't got value for money. So you need to make sure you've got a termination for convenience. And it needs to be quite a short notice period, not 6 months, not 12 months, 5 days, 10 days, whatever, shorter the better. And you need to make sure that termination for convenience doesn't come with a cost. Because, you want to make sure you can get out without having to pay the supply. Also avoid automatic renewals. These service long-term contracts, you want to make sure that just because you don't serve notice on a particular date, that it automatically rolls over. So you need to eliminate those automatic renewals. So warranties. You're procuring an emergency, you need to make sure the products and services, meet some specifications. Now, with all the best will and will, you would want the time to make sure that the specifications are robust, actually meet your requirements, but you may not have that time. So, if you haven't got the time, you need a general sort of warranty saying that it's fit for purpose. You need to make sure fitness for purpose, which is a bit of a catch-all, but it's better than having nothing. So you need to make sure you've got that warranty. Also avoid those clauses which say all the implied warranties under the Sale of Goods Act are excluded. You need to be sort of ensure that you've got the benefit of that protection, because you haven't got the express warranties, so you haven't had the time to negotiate them, so you need to rely on the implied warranties. So you make sure that there's no clause which excluding those implied warranties. And also you need to think about the consequences for a breach of warranty. What happens if there's a breach of warranty? Do you want a refund of the amounts paid? Probably not practical. What you want there to do is basically actually remedy it and then give you replacement goods and services that actually meet your requirements. That's the remedy you want in an emergency. You're not so concerned about getting a refund or having them actually, have a remedial plan process to actually remedy things. You basically want to substitute good or service that actually supply. Long-term commitments. Avoid long-term commitments. You don't want to be tied into exclusivity. Remember, you're doing this in an emergency. You don't want them to say, well, if you enter in this agreement, this is an exclusive agreement. Because you want to be in the situation where after the emergency, you can say, okay, thanks very much. We want to go out to the market and get, do a proper procurement. You don't want to be tied into this procurement contract that you've done in an emergency. Minimum volumes. You also want to avoid where you're procuring minimum volumes. You don't want to be tied in to actually procuring a certain amount because you've done it in an emergency and you haven't had the time to negotiate. There may be certain things that even though you're really desperate to enter into this contract, there are some bare essentials that you may want to insist on the contract. For example, you may want to ensure compliance with your own policies. For example, anti-slavery and human trafficking policy, bribery act, IT security data policy. There may be others. So what are the minimum policies you want the supplier to comply with, regardless of the situation while you're entering into that contract? Right to inspect test goods, again, a useful provision. It may be necessary for you to have this right. Whether you get that or not depends on your negotiating leverage and how much time there is before the actual delivery and the time that you have to actually inspect. Title and risk, there's a number of permutations here, as you know, in title and risk provisions, but for an emergency, you probably want title and risk transferring on delivery. It's a very simplistic approach, but I think that is probably best practice. Pricing, as I mentioned, you're procuring an emergency, so you probably haven't got best value for money, but what you need to make sure in the pricing is what's included in the pricing, what's excluded from the pricing. You want some kind of capital protection between placing of the order and the actual delivery. You don't want to be in the situation where you agree a price, and then when they deliver it, they say, oh, okay, we've had increased costs. You need to pay us this. Because you're so desperate, you will probably pay that. So you need a contractual provision to ensure that the supplier doesn't have that ability. What about additional costs and extras? Are there any suppliers out there? I should have asked this question before I started the session. No? Okay, good. Suppliers are really like these kind of situations because it gives them a lot of ability to actually, increase prices, have the ability to actually not take advantage, but be a bit more, I guess, creative in their pricing and so forth. So, you want to make sure that all additional costs and extras are minimized, or at least you're aware of what theirs are, because you want to avoid the situation of scope creep. Timing, as I mentioned, avoid paying in advance. As soon as you pay in advance, you've lost your leverage, or whatever leverage you've had. So you need to ensure that you don't pay in advance. You may be forced to pay sort of some kind of percentage, but withhold or retain a certain percentage until you actually get the goods delivered or the services delivered. Other things you need to look out for in contracts is giving open and unlimited indemnity. So you want to make sure that you don't have any clauses where you as a contracting authority or a customer gives an open and unlimited indemnity. You need to make sure you minimize that. I would avoid giving any indemnities, but if you can't, you need to make sure that indemnity is capped by a suitable limitation on liability. Protection of confidential information. You may be desperate, yes, but you still need to protect your confidential information, particularly if the supplier is coming in, has access to your data, your systems. You need to make sure there's robust confidentiality provisions in that contract. Compliance with laws and regulations. You want to make sure the supplier complies with all laws and regulations. As I said, you are desperate, but you still want to make sure that they do this. Governing law jurisdiction. Again, it's all the best will in the world. You may do a risk assessment exercise, but you don't want to sign up to a contract governed by Congo law, for example. You need to make sure that it's appropriate, and in this case, it should be England and Wales. So those are sort of things that you need to think about. I know it's a bit of a helicopter rocket whistle-stop tour of sort of key contractual provision. Those are the things when you're looking at sort of procuring sort of new goods and services under new contracts. But what about after that? What about the existing contracts you've got? What can you do to sort of, get sort of the protection or benefit from those existing contracts? So it really depends on the nature of the emergency. As Chris said, emergencies can be defined in a variety of methods. But, if it's the fault of the supply, for example, if the supply goes insolvent, is that really an emergency in the sense that that supplier gets sort of benefit from that? So you need to think about what caused the emergency. So if the supplier caused the emergency, there's a lot of, opportunity for you to say, hang on, you're in control of your own destiny. You can't use the emergency to get more benefit from that. So you need to look at what the trigger of the emergency is. I talked about the definition of force majeure. Look at the definition of force majeure and look how it interplays with business continuity and disaster recovery. Say, for example, in an IT project, and an IT supplier is providing IT services. As part of those IT services, they provide business continuity and disaster recovery, in an emergency. Now, you don't want the IT supplier go, oh, there's an emergency, we don't have to provide business continuity and disaster recovery. That's nonsense. That's the very instance you would want them to provide business continuity and disaster recovery. So you need to make sure that those kind of obligations are carved out of force majeure, so they can't rely on force majeure to eliminate those kind of things. And then step-in rights. If your long-term services contract has step-in rights, look at what the step-in rights are, look at what the triggers are. So step-in rights, as we all know, are basically in a contract where you don't want to terminate the contract. Effectively, you sort of step in either using your own staff or your own assets, or you bring a third party in, such as the Olympic situation where, G4S, basically government exercises step-in rights, and the board and the government, the military, to provide those services. So you need to look at what the procedures are for invoking those step-in rights. So what kind of emergency is it? Is it a force majeure event? Is it a natural disaster? Is it a regulated sort of event imposed by a regulator? What are the restrictions for a step-in? So you want to make sure when you step in, you're complying with the letter of the contract. So you don't want to make sure you sort of go beyond what the contract provides. So for example, in many step-in clauses, it doesn't allow you to bring a competitor of the service provider in, because that'll mean that you're in breach of the contract. So you need to make sure you know what the restrictions are in terms of step-in right. What are the costs? Who carries the cost for step-in? And what happens to the charges and pricing? Worst case scenario is you're stepping in yourself, or you bring a third party in, and you're paying for that, and then you're also paying the service charges. You don't want to be sort of basically paying for the service provider for performing a service which has failed, and that's the reason why you step in. So you need some kind of rebate or adjustment of the charges to sort of ensure that you're paying what you would have paid if you were getting the services. Step out. What are the step out triggers? Often contracts talk about step in. What are the triggers for step in? But what are the triggers for step out? When do you need to step out? When do you need to finish providing services and give it back to the service provider? So in terms of summary, review, or in parentheses, read the contract, please. Undertake a risk assessment. Regardless of whether you can negotiate or not, you need to actually undertake a risk assessment so you know what risk your organisation, contracting authority is accepting. Negotiate the key provisions. You haven't got the time to do, negotiate all the provisions, but you need to focus and hone in on those key provisions that really matter. And look at, after you've done that, look at the protection in the existing contracts that you've got in terms of step in terms of how you can get benefit from using the existing contracts. That's it.